Welcome everyone. This lecture is going to be a little bit of a hodgepodge of several learning objectives, but we're talking about different types of species that are kind of special in the environment. So invasive species, endangered species, keystone species, foundation species, and indicator species. Like I said, we got a couple learning objectives from a couple different units. We're going to wrap up ecological succession, that topic 2.7, by talking about keystone species and indicator species. And then we're going to move fast forward way further into the school year to our last unit, looking at topics 9.8 and 9.9, invasive and endangered species respectively. The vocab is here. I will tell you that I forgot to switch this up, so this is a little bit different order than what is actually in the PowerPoint, but that's okay. So we're going to start with keystone species. A keystone species is any species on which many other species in an ecosystem depend. Basically, if you remove the keystone species, you're going to have these trophic cascades where one species goes that really depends on the keystone, and another species, and another species, and another species, all that radiate out from this keystone species, all moving down the food chain as well. So you'll have a trophic cascade, which is essentially a ripple effect throughout the trophic levels, throughout a food web, okay, throughout an ecosystem. These keystone species can be at any trophic level, but we typically think about them as top predators, but we will often see them also as producers or primary consumers. Okay, and the analogy comes from an arch. So if you know architecture, if you know arches, you would build a wooden frame inside of this arch that has this shape. And then on that, you would lay one stone after another, obviously moving from the bottom up because of gravity. You would do that on both sides until you get to this keystone, this last piece which holds the arch together. You put that keystone in, and it is locking that arch in place, and then you can remove your wooden frame, and if all goes well, the thing does not collapse. So that's where the term comes from the keystone of an arch. Without the keystone species, being the otter in this case, the entire ecosystem collapses. So this is a simplified diagram of a kelp forest that you would see off of, say, the coast of Washington State, Oregon State, California, Alaska, British Columbia, Japan, around the Pacific. Okay, they occur pretty like pretty much all over the world in the right type of water, but the otter only occurs in the Pacific Ocean, the sea otter. And this is definitely a simplified diagram. What you're not showing is thousands of species of fish and invertebrates that also occupy this water. Okay, so the otter is the keystone species. It basically controls the population of sea urchin. It will eat the sea urchin, and they love the little sea urchins. Sea urchins eat kelp. Okay, that was a bad arrow if I'm showing a food web, so or food chain. So sea urchins eat kelp, the sea otters eat the sea urchins. The more sea otters you have, the less sea urchins you're going to have. You remove the otter, which they did from overhunting them in the 1800s, and the sea urchin population explodes, goes out of control, and overgrazes the kelp, and all of these other species that depend on the kelp forest also disappear. So the otter is there as the keystone. You remove this keystone, and the entire arch crumbles. Okay, and then I'll let you guys read this quote from Darwin, just talking about kelp forests. I won't read it to you. We also have wolves in Yellowstone. We'll talk about this one in class. I'll show a video. I'll also show a video of the otters too, but essentially with the wolves, in a brief, wolves were extirpated from the park by 1926. So by 1926, there was no wolves in Yellowstone. And because there was no wolves hunting the elk, especially, their elk populations exploded. And what elk really like to eat are willows and young aspen that are right on the bank of the river. And without the wolves, they could just park in place and eat as much as they wanted to and just overgraze all of the vegetation along the banks of the rivers. Without that vegetation holding the soil together, the rivers would start to erode away the banks, and these rivers, it led to massive erosion along these rivers. Then they introduced wolves, and they weren't really thinking that that would fix that specific problem, but it was an unintended positive consequence. The wolves keep the elk on the move. They can't park in one place and just eat at their leisure, so they move from place to place to place. They don't really border up next to a river as often because that river is a natural obstacle for them to cross. And if you have wolves on one side and a river on the other side, then that's not a great place to be. So they would just be moving throughout the landscape and not overgrazing any one place. The vegetation along the riverbanks returns, so you have all of these willows and the young aspen and the young cottonwoods along the riverbank, stabilizing the soil, allowing that river to, or preventing that river from eroding the soil anymore. Along with that, though, you have this trickle-down effect of other species that depend on the river. So you have species like beaver starting to increase their population size because they have all of the willow and aspen and cottonwoods that they really like to eat. They have those available to them. So beaver populations increase. Beaver populations create beaver dams. So as beaver dams increase, you have these pools formed behind them. The river starts to move a lot slower, and you have other species like fish and salamanders and other amphibians that benefit from the beavers dams. You also have songbirds that are benefiting from all of the willow and everything as well because it's a place for them to hide and a place for them to nest. And then a wolf kill will provide food for bears to scavenge, for eagles and ravens to scavenge. So once the wolves are done eating that carcass, the bear will move in and eat its fill, as well as the ravens and everything else. Wolves also outcompete coyotes. So without the coyotes, the vole populations increase, the fox populations can increase, and that allows them to return to what their sizes naturally were, and the antelope populations also increase. So you have all of these trickle down effects from the wolves controlling, I shouldn't cross out the elk or the coyote, but the wolves lowering the populations of elk and coyote. They didn't really even lower the populations of the elk too much. They just kept them on the move more so, and they did lower it just a little bit, but mostly the sick, the old, the weak, and the young. All right. So the trickle-down effects from reintroducing wolves, you remove wolves from the ecosystem, the entire thing starts to collapse. And then one plant example are tropical fig trees. So these are found in many of the tropical rainforests and tropical dry deciduous forests, tropical dry forests. And they often, especially in the rainforest, will fruit several times a year. So they provide fruit when many other species of plants are barren of fruit. And in some forests, they about 70% of animals eat either the figs or the animals that eat the figs. So you remove the figs and those animals will go, and then the predators will also go. Okay. So we'll watch these two videos in class. I'm going to skip that and move on to foundation species. This is kind of similar to the keystone species, but rather than being at the top of the arch, the foundation species are at the bottom of the arch. They're at the foundation. They are the ones that are creating the complex ecosystem just by their presence. So the kelp are the foundation of the kelp forest. The willows and the Yellowstone streambake are the foundation of that ecosystem. They provide the habitat for all the birds, and they provide the food for the beavers, and they're just holding down the soil, and they're keeping that habitat as it is, and they're the foundation of that habitat. Another great example is mangroves in a mangrove forest. They would be over 90% of the plant species in that forest, if not 100%. I should point out that not all that foundation species are not keystone species. And for example, just to illustrate that, going back to the figs, figs are not the dominant trees in the forest. You typically have like one fig every, so often, let's say one fig tree per acre, and they're definitely not the foundation, but they are a keystone. Foundation species are the dominant species in that making up that ecosystem. So just contrasting the two, keystone species have a greater than normal impact. You remove them and the entire ecosystem collapses. So they are at the top of this. They're at the center and top of the arch, the keystone, and removal causes the ecosystem to collapse. Foundation species really create the foundation. They create the habitat for those other species in that ecosystem. So again, it is the kelp and the kelp forest. Without them, everything else would not even be there in the first place. So they contribute to the structure and maintenance of that ecosystem. Okay, they're typically, or they are, the dominant vegetation of that ecosystem. So switching gears a little bit and moving away from keystone and foundation species, we have indicator species or bioindicators. These are not really super important for the ecosystem as a whole. They're just a normal species in the ecosystem, but they're really important for humans to detect levels of pollution or anything else that's going wrong in that ecosystem. So they're species that reveal the quality or status of their local environment. That could be the presence of pollutants, it could be soil quality, water quality, etc. So these are all examples of indicator species, or at least the ones from the stonefly nymph to the tubiflex worm. And we're looking at pollution level down here. So if pollution level is very low, stonefly nymphs are going to exist and they're going to be present in large numbers. But as quality goes down, stonefly nymphs are going to disappear and be replaced by dragonfly nymphs. You'll notice that this is a pond. It's still water. They like that still water to hunt. And then greater levels of pollution, you'll have more freshwater shrimp. You'll not have any dragonfly nymphs or stonefly nymphs. Gets even further down and you have the hog louse. As we lose our dissolved oxygen, you have the tubiflex worm, which is like the only animal in this system that would survive in very low or anoxic conditions or even hypoxic conditions. If you have extreme pollution, then you're not going to have any life at all. So all of those are indicator species telling you where on this scale you are. Some other examples of indicator species, lichen are really good at identifying sulfur dioxide, especially, sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere, but what that's really useful for is like coming from volcanic activity or coming from the combustion of coal, coming from the combustion of diesel, any of those things. When lichen are present, and there's specific species of lichen that you're looking at that are a little bit beyond what we need to get into, but if they're present, there's little to no pollution. If they're absent, that probably means that pollution is there. If they were there in like 1970 and they're not there anymore, that means that something has changed in the environment and it's probably some type of pollution that we can then further investigate. Another example, high algal growth can indicate whether there's fertilizers. Remember, those are nitrates or phosphates predominant, PO4, my bad. Whether there's nitrates or phosphates predominantly, but it could be other nutrients like iron, and that will cause algal blooms, which would then cause eutrophic waters. So if there's a high presence of algae, that indicates a lot of nutrients. Certain plants can be indicators of soil type, especially if we're looking at heavy metals. So some plants are especially adapted to grow on heavy metal soils. So if you see only those ones and no quote unquote normal plants, then you know that your soil is high in heavy metals, and that could be residue from mining activity as far back as the Stone Age, but probably more recent in the 1800s or 1900s. And then animals, a lot of different animals, especially amphibians, are really susceptible to many types of pollutants, and they can be malformed. This is not photoshopped. Those are frogs that have grown without one or more of their back legs fully developed. Okay, so that would be the presence of pollutants or indicate that. Our next special type of species, so shifting gears yet again, is an invasive species. These are a species that are introduced from somewhere else and they become established in the new ecosystem and negatively affect that ecosystem. Now, I should say that I definitely need to point out that invasive species are totally harmless for the most part, typically, in their natural habitat. They have checks and balances, they have predators, they have prey, well, I guess predators, they have parasites, they have diseases, they have, checks in their environment that will keep their population levels stable. They have, maybe they're a disease that has natural resistance in the species that they infect in their natural environment. They get moved to a new environment where species that they're competing with or predating on or infecting don't have any genetic or adaptive adaptations. That was a bad way to say that. Don't have any adaptations to those invasive species, and then they kind of explode in population size and really affect that area. So they are typically harmless in their native habitat because there are these checks and balances that keep their populations in place. Okay. These invasive species can negatively impact ecology, environmental health, economics, or human health. Okay. These two, environmental health and ecology, are pretty much the same thing. They are introduced by humans. So in order to be an invasive species, they have to check off these boxes. They have to be non-native to that area that you're looking at. They have to be introduced by humans, either accidentally or intentionally, and they have to negatively impact one of these four things. Okay, so not all introduced species are invasive. Some species that are introduced can be mostly harmless. Okay, they can just, maybe not even breed in that new habitat, or even if they do breed, their populations or levels are so low that they're just established and they're mostly harmless. Okay, or they naturalize into that environment, and there are some species that make checks and balances on them, and they don't take over an environment, they don't negatively infect that environment, they just kind of naturalize into it. Okay, and then if they do check off one of these four boxes, negatively impact ecology, human health, economics, then they are considered invasive. Okay, so to be invasive, they have to really fit all of the above, and not all introduced species are invasive. So all invasive species originate somewhere else, so they are native to some place on the planet, obviously, and they do coexist in that natural habitat with the other species that are there. Again, they do maintain stable population size due to ecological checks and balances. But they go to their new ecosystem and there are no checks and balances. Most invasive species are going to be generalists. They're going to be R-selected or R-strategists, whichever term you prefer to use. They tend to outcompete native species. They tend to have no predators or parasites in that new region. The prey that, if they are predators, prey have ecological naivete. So that means that they don't recognize that new species as a threat. So for example, you have dodos and dogs. We all know what the dodo birds are, and we all know that they're extinct. They evolved on the island of Mauritius without any natural predators. So then all of a sudden you have these dogs that come, or cats, but mostly dogs that come onto the island, and they don't recognize them as a threat. They're naive to what a predator is. Okay, and then the hosts of invasive pathogens have no genetic resistance. So we've talked about the chestnut, the American chestnut, and the chestnut. Geez, for some reason I'm blanking on it. It's not chestnut blight, the disease that affects the chestnut. But the American chestnut had no resistance to that pathogen. Okay. Yeah, sorry, it is chestnut blight. I don't know what I'm thinking. So some notable examples. I will say that this is a little bit North American centric because we do live in North America. So really invasive species are shuffled all over the world. You can have a North American species that are invasive in Asia. You can have Asian species that are invasive in North America, just flip-flopping all over the world. Okay, so I'll let you guys read through this. I'm not going to read every single example to you, but I'll let you guys read through this. And then really interesting, if you just spend a few minutes on Wikipedia looking at their list of invasive species, it is mind-blowing how many invasive species there are, how many species we've shuffled around the planet, introducing into new ecosystems, either intentionally or accidentally. So I'll let you guys peruse that. I'll link that in the description. Some more examples, we tend to think about invasive species as animals, but they definitely include plants, they include fungi, they include any type of species. Okay, so I'll let you guys read through these as well. So how can we control for invasive species? What are some solutions for invasive species? They are varied, but they're often specific to the taxonomic group that we're looking at, right? If we're trying to control a fungus, that's going to be very different than if we're trying to control a Burmese python, for example. Some types of controls, just in broad sense, are going to include prevention. So just preventing that species from getting there in the first place. That is what's being shown with this sign up here. Maybe some of you guys have been boating in the United States and you've had to have your boats checked for mussels. What they're looking for is zebra mussels, which are native to, I believe, the Baltic region in Eurasia. They were introduced via ship ballast to the Great Lakes and have spread throughout North America just by hitching rides from on one boat to another, from lake to lake to lake, or from river system as well. So just prevention. Okay, so that includes awareness, that includes education, monitoring for them, so inspections, examining clothes, shoes, baggage, boats, ballast, all of that stuff. For example, like if you travel really anywhere on the planet and you're like, wearing your dirty old hiking boots, you really should clean them before and after going into any new environment. Okay, if you're just taking them, from I don't know, from the Colorado Rockies down to Costa Rica, you should clean them beforehand and then clean them after you come back, just because you don't want to carry just any seeds or any pathogens in your clothes or in your shoes. All right, just something as simple as that. Physical removal, that's what these people are doing here. So weeding plants, just like, there are volunteer activities where you can go up into the Colorado Rockies and you'll see, or even like Montana Rockies especially, you'll see just field of purple loosestrife going through and trying to weed all of them out. That could be weeding plants, that could be fishing for invasive fish, such as Asian carp in the United States, scraping mussels off of boats, like we talked about above, trapping rodents, hunting pythons in the Everglades, or cane toads in Australia. We'll talk about cane toads in class, they're really interesting. Just the story behind them. This one's interesting, biological control. So say that you have an invasive species, you can introduce a predator or a pathogen for that species intentionally. One example of that is introducing weevils onto purple loosestrife. Okay, so purple loosestrife that you saw on the previous slide is an invasive plant from Eurasia, and it can produce thousands of seeds, and it has this long taproot, thousands of seeds a year, tens of thousands of seeds a year, and it has this long taproot that if you don't get totally pulled up, it will come back. So it's really hard to remove it. So what do? They introduce this weevil after lots of scientific investigation and experimentation and trials to make sure that it won't harm anything in the North American ecosystem. They introduced this weevil. They found that it just stays in the purple loosestrife. It damages the purple loosestrife, prevents it from reproducing, and purple loosestrife populations have gone down. We can contrast that with some creating even worse problems. So you try to introduce a new predator or a new pathogen and it just backfires, unintended consequences. For example, introducing mongoose to Hawaii to control rats. So rats were and remain a huge problem on the island of Hawaii. They primarily eat bird eggs and some of the rare insects on Hawaii. You introduce the mongoose on the Hawaii to control the rats. Everybody thinks it's a great idea, but the problem is that the rats are nocturnal, the mongoose are diurnal, so they're not out at the same time, and the mongoose are just predating on the birds anyway, and they're eating the birds and their eggs instead. So you create an even worse problem. Okay. And then we have chemical control, stuff like insecticides, herbicides, and animal control, animal poisons. I should quickly mention that one problem with chemical control is that you're just introducing a new problem, and that's chemical pollution, right? If you're poisoning all the rats on an island, something's probably going to eat those dead rodents. So you might be unintentionally poisoning the buzzards or the crows or whatever native bird is eating those poisoned rats. Okay. Endangered species. We've already talked about Endangered Species Act. We've talked about CITES. We talked about the IUCN Red List. So if you need to review that, go back to that PowerPoint. But an endangered species is any species that's high risk of becoming extinct. Essentially, in the IUCN Red List, anything from there over. Okay. Well, not extinct in the wild, just endangered and critically endangered. Okay. Most endangered species are going to be your specialists, and they're going to be your K-selected species. Just like invasive species, I would invite you to look at the list of endangered species that the IUCN Red List has identified on Wikipedia. It again is mind-blowing how many there are. And these endangered species can be threatened with any one or more of the following. So we've talked about this acronym HIPCO before, and any one or more of those can cause a species to lose population size or to decrease in population size and eventually become endangered. And we'll talk about specific examples of endangered species in class, even more so than we talked about on the Endangered Species Act and CITES PowerPoint, but we'll talk about some more in class. I'll show a video. But some ways to protect endangered species. Legislation is huge. Legislation is one of the big ones in this. And legislation really is incorporated into many of these other bullet points. Okay, so legislation is big. Criminalizing and prosecuting, it's not enough just to criminalize, but you have to also prosecute illegal activity. Again, that is part of legislation. So that includes poaching, that includes illegal animal trade, illegal fishing practices, pollution, etc. Okay, so prosecuting those, well, first setting up the laws and then enforcing those laws. Protection of habitat. Again, this is typically done through legislation, but it can also be done at the local level. Okay, just more of a grassroots campaign. Creation of parks and preserves are big. So setting aside large tracts of land or marine habitat for the preservation of that ecosystem and the species that occupy that ecosystem. If you're preserving one species in an ecosystem, say a rhino, you are by extension preserving, by setting up a park, you're by extension preserving all the other species that share that habitat. Okay. And one notable thing in here is a conservation easement. This is a binding legal agreement that preserves land from further development in exchange for tax write-offs. So it's still private land. So with a conservation easement, you still own your land, but you're given tax write-offs or to compensate the losses that you're getting from not using that land. Okay, so all of those are really legislation in nature. You can also have just tax incentives or other types of incentives as well to protect endangered species. Also, not on, further down here, just awareness, grassroots campaigns, all of that, small actions at a local level can have big effects. Okay. All right, so just returning to the learning objectives, talking about these unique species. We talked about keystone species. Foundation species is not in the learning objectives, but keystone species. We talked about indicator species. And then we talked about invasive species. So invasive species are species that can live and sometimes thrive outside their normal habitat, so they're introduced. Invasive species can sometimes be beneficial. I really don't like that statement because by definition they're not, but they're considered invasive when they threaten native species. I think that what this is supposed to say is that an introduced species can be beneficial. So say that, cows are really great because we like to eat them, but they're introduced into an ecosystem. Or maybe like wild horses in the Americas, they're introduced and they've just naturalized into the North American landscape as wild mustangs. But I don't think that they meant to say invasive species can sometimes be beneficial. I think that they mean to say they're introduced species, and then they're considered invasive when they threaten native species. Again, they either have to threaten native species, the ecology of the area, human health, or economics. Okay. Invasive species are often generalists, are selected species, and therefore may outcompete native species for resources, especially if those native species are specialists. And then invasive species can be controlled through a variety of means. And then moving on to endangered species, a lot of this is overlap for when we talked about endangered species before, but a variety of factors can lead to species becoming threatened with extinction, so think about all those things of HIPCO. Not all species will be in danger of extinction when exposed to the same changes in their ecosystem. Again, ecosystems are dynamic and the processes that go into ecosystems are dynamic, and species respond to those differently because all species are different. Species that are able to adapt to changes in their environment or that are able to move to a new environment are less likely to face extinction. Again, it's the specialists that really will face extinction most likely. Selective pressures are any factors that change the behavior and fitness of organisms within the environment. We've talked about that before, mostly ecological tolerances. With that, species in a given ecosystem compete for resources like territory, food, mates, and habitat, and this competition may lead to endangerment or extinction, again, something that we've talked about a lot before, and strategies to protect animal populations include criminalizing poaching, protecting animal habitats, and legislation. All right, so hope you guys learned something, and I'll see you all in class. Bye.